You call it anxiety, but maybe it's just withdrawal from a certainty that never existed. You've been taught to chase control, to keep things organized, to hold yourself together with plans, predictions, and mental rehearsals, as if life were a puzzle you could solve. If only you tried hard enough, stayed disciplined enough, stayed alert. But what if the thing you're calling discipline is really fear in a suit and tie? There's a pressure behind your eyes, a tightness in your chest that won't dissolve, no matter how many routines you try to follow. You wake up and feel it before you open your eyes. The throb of some invisible pressure. You push through it. You do what you're supposed to do. But deep down, there's a voice, quiet but relentless, whispering, something isn't right. You've convinced yourself that it's anxiety, a condition, a flaw, a malfunction of some kind. But what if it's something else? What if it's the unconscious trying to speak, not with words, but with symptoms? Carl Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And maybe that's what all this noise is, avoidance. Because to face your soul is to admit you don't know where this is going. You don't know who you'll be when the masks fall off. You don't know what happens if you stop pretending. So you cling to schedules, to timelines, to the illusion of clarity. And every time life resists your control, you panic, not because the situation is bad, but because your script no longer fits. There's no shame in that. You built these mechanisms because you needed to survive. But the truth is, they're failing. And that failure isn't a breakdown, it's a call, a sacred collapse, inviting you to meet the part of you that's always been silenced, the one who doesn't need certainty to breathe. Schopenhauer once said, "The greatest wisdom is to realize how little we control, and yet how much we pretend." And you've been pretending so well, so convincingly, you even fooled yourself. But now your body is catching up. It's showing you the cost of control, the tension, the insomnia, the shallow breath, the endless scanning of what might go wrong. You're not drowning. You're clinging to a rock that's already sinking. Let go. Not of life, but of the lie that you ever had to dominate it to be safe, because maybe the peace you seek isn't on the other side of control. But in the moment you finally allow yourself to be dismantled, you tell yourself it's about getting things done, about being productive, about building a better life. But the truth is quieter, more fragile, almost imperceptible until it begins to bleed through your smile. Every task you write down, every goal you organize, every future you try to calculate in your head before making a single move, it's not always ambition. Sometimes it's protection, because the unknown doesn't just scare you, it threatens the whole story you've used to survive. You build routines like scaffolding. You cling to time blocks and schedules as if they could hold back the flood. And maybe they did, for a while. Maybe the planning helped you feel less fragile, less lost, less exposed to the wildness of life. But underneath the spreadsheets and vision boards, there's a tension, the fear that if you stop managing everything, you'll fall apart. Psychologists call it intolerance of uncertainty, but it's more than a theory. It's a life, your life, a life where every pause feels like danger, where every deviation from the plan triggers a low-grade panic that never fully goes away. A life where rest doesn't feel like peace. It feels like irresponsibility. Because deep down, you're not building to create. You're building to not collapse. You're trying to outrun the voice that says, if I don't control this, everything will go wrong. But what if that voice isn't wise, just wounded? What if it was born the moment you first learned that unpredictability could mean abandonment, pain, chaos? So now you try to predict everything, control everything, shape reality into something you can tolerate. But reality doesn't play by your rules. And every time it slips through your fingers, your body tightens, your chest knots. You look for the next strategy, the next fix, the next illusion of safety. But maybe it's not working anymore. Maybe the exhaustion you feel isn't because you're doing too much, but because you're carrying a fear too heavy to name. The fear of falling, of failing, of finally realizing that no plan, no matter how perfect, can save you from being human. And that's where the pain begins to soften. When you realize you were never meant to be saved by certainty, you were meant to be shaped by presence, even in chaos. You keep waiting for a sign, for clarity, for a version of yourself that finally feels ready. You whisper to yourself, not now, soon, when it feels right. And so, the days pass. The seasons shift, but the moment you're waiting for never arrives. Because it was never about timing. It was about fear dressed as logic. You say you're waiting for alignment, for that perfect convergence of energy, stability, inspiration. But that's not the truth. The truth is, you're hoping for a life where risk doesn't exist, where pain has been removed in advance, where every step forward is padded with certainty. But that life doesn't exist, and deep down, you know that. You know that perfection is a fantasy, that clarity comes after the leap, not before. And yet, you wait. You wait because to move without guarantees feels like self-betrayal, like recklessness, like standing naked in the middle of a storm and hoping to survive. But what if that's the only way to actually live? The myth of the right time is seductive. It tells you that postponing action is a form of wisdom, but it's not. It's paralysis. It's the ego trying to negotiate with chaos. You're not avoiding mistakes, you're avoiding chaos. And in doing so, you're postponing life. Existential courage isn't about charging into the unknown with bravado. It's about standing at the edge of uncertainty, shaking, and still saying yes, because there will never be a day when everything feels safe. There will never be a moment where your fear has disappeared completely. And that's not a failure of readiness. That's the human condition. The pain you feel when you think about taking a risk isn't a warning. It's a birth, and the longer you wait for safety, the further you drift from yourself. You say, I'm not ready. But maybe readiness isn't a state. Maybe it's a decision, a quiet, trembling decision to stop waiting for a perfect life and start living an honest one. You say you want clarity, but sometimes what you really want is numbness. You want the answer not because it sets you free, but because it stops the noise. Because in the silence between knowing and not knowing, something starts to ache, something raw, something ancient. So you reach for certainty the way a patient reaches for morphine, not to heal, but to escape the weight of pain. There's a strange relief in being sure, even when it's a lie, even when the thing you're sure of is killing you slowly. Because at least it gives you something to hold, something solid, something that doesn't change shape every time you breathe. But certainty is not safety. It's sedation. It softens the fear, flattens the edges, and in doing so, it flattens you. You become smaller, less curious, less alive. The illusion of control becomes your comfort drug, a way to delay the real work, the work of feeling, the work of facing, the work of letting go of the stories that used to protect you, but now suffocate you. There's a kind of grief that comes with honesty, the grief of realizing that your neatly arranged beliefs, your tight emotional routines, your planned-out future, they were all built to shield you from chaos. But chaos was never the enemy. It was the teacher. Certainty is comforting, but it will never make you whole. Because healing is not a process of knowing more, it's a process of feeling more, of allowing discomfort, of being in the dark long enough to notice that your eyes are beginning to adjust. You don't want answers, you want sedation, but sedation will never give you back what fear took away, your ability to trust yourself in the dark. You think you're overwhelmed because you have too much to do, too many obligations. Too many plates spinning at once. But that's not the real weight. The real weight is pretending that this life, this version of you, still fits. It doesn't, and your body knows it. That tightness in your chest isn't from stress. It's from dissonance, from the conflict between the roles you perform and the truth you've buried underneath them. You smile, you nod, you carry conversations like a ghost holding a script, and yet, somewhere deeper, there's a part of you that's trying to scream. But it can't, so it panics. Anxiety isn't always fear of the future. Sometimes it's rebellion, the soul's final way of saying, "This isn't me." Jung called it psychic splitting. When your outer life becomes a mask too far removed from your inner world, the psyche begins to fracture. And that fracture doesn't show up as clarity. It shows up as insomnia, as irritability, as that sudden moment in the middle of the afternoon where you forget who you are and wonder if you've ever really known. You keep saying you're fine, that you just need a break, a reset, a few days off. But it's not rest you're missing, it's alignment. Every time you perform a version of yourself that no longer feels true, your system revolts. Every time you silence that inner dissonance just to maintain appearances, your soul suffocates a little more. And so anxiety comes, not as an enemy, but as a signal, a crack in the illusion, a pulse of honesty that can no longer be repressed. You are not fragile. You're just exhausted from living a life that contradicts what you deeply know, a life that rewards masks and punishes presence, a life that praises performance but forgets the person behind it. Your body is panicking because your soul can't scream loud enough. You don't think to solve, you think to survive. Your mind spins scenarios like a broken film reel, rewinding, fast-forwarding, analyzing every angle of a life you still haven't lived. You call it preparation, intelligence, even self-awareness. But beneath all that noise is something much more fragile, the fear of feeling. You've trained your thoughts to protect you from your own emotions, because feeling means vulnerability, and vulnerability means risk. So you build a fortress of logic, of questions, of what-ifs. But the more you think, the less you act. The more you analyze, the less you move. Until eventually, you're not living, you're rehearsing. Rehearsing conversations that never happen. Rehearsing collapses that never come. Rehearsing futures that exist only in the echo chamber of your mind. This isn't clarity, it's entrapment, rumination masquerading as insight, exhaustion disguised as control. You don't trust silence, because in silence, the feelings return. The unresolved ones, the forgotten ones, the ones that don't fit into any logical pattern. So you keep thinking, not because you're curious, but because you're terrified. Because the moment you stop thinking, you might have to feel what you've been avoiding, and that is a confrontation you've postponed for years. You built a labyrinth inside your mind and called it protection, but you've walked these corridors 1,000 times. You know every dead end, every echo, every lie you've told yourself to stay safe, and still you stay, not because the labyrinth is comfortable, but because it's familiar. Because even suffering, when repeated enough times, begins to feel like home. But there's a door. There's always a door. It doesn't lead to certainty. It doesn't offer answers. It offers only one thing: the possibility of being real again. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. You think you need to be certain before you move, before you speak, before you become, but certainty is not a foundation. It's a prison you've decorated to look like safety. You want clarity, closure, a sense that the next step will lead somewhere predictable. You tell yourself, once I'm sure, I'll act. But behind that logic hides something deeper, something far more tender. You're not waiting for certainty. You're avoiding the grief of becoming someone you no longer recognize. Because every step toward the unknown isn't just a decision. It's a funeral, a mourning of who you used to be or thought you had to be. The one who was loved for being stable. The one who was praised for being consistent. The one who survived by staying small enough to be understood. And so, you stay. You stay because even suffering can feel safer than reinvention. At least suffering is familiar. But identity is not a statue. It's not a thing you discover and protect. It's a story, fluid, changing, often incoherent. And the more you try to freeze it, the more it breaks. You've made confidence a condition for movement. But confidence doesn't precede transformation. It follows it. It's not the reason you leap, it's what arrives after the fall, when you realize you survived. The version of you that's trying to be sure is terrified, not of failing, but of disappearing. And still, you long for more. You ache for the truth of who you could be, if only you stopped clinging to the identity certainty promised and had the courage to be unfinished. You don't want certainty. You want to avoid mourning the version of you that certainty would destroy. You've spent your life chasing something that doesn't exist, a form of freedom that feels like comfort, like predictability, like nothing will ever go wrong again. But real freedom is not peace without risk. It's the willingness to move, even when your legs are shaking. The opposite of fear isn't security, it's movement. It's the quiet decision to act, knowing the fall might hurt, and still stepping forward. You want the storm to pass before you begin, but the truth is you begin inside the storm, with doubt in your chest and silence in your mouth, with no script, no applause, no guarantee, only the raw presence of your own breath and the trembling yes that rises from your bones. This is not recklessness, this is birth. Every act of becoming requires rupture. Viktor Frankl didn't find meaning in comfort. He found it in confrontation, in choosing, under pressure, to make life speak. Not because it was easy, but because meaning doesn't arrive fully formed. It's forged, in risk, in decision, in uncertainty. You've been waiting for peace, but peace isn't something you wait for. It's something you carry through the fire. Because freedom is not found at the end of certainty. It's found in the moment you stop demanding guarantees and start trusting that the voice still whispering inside you is worth listening to. Stop waiting for permission, not from the world, not from your past, and not from the fear you've mistaken for wisdom. Walk into the storm holding your breath and see which voice stays with you. You've crafted a life where almost nothing surprises you, where every feeling has a name, every reaction a justification, every moment a plan. You call it maturity, stability, growth, but somewhere along the way, something stopped waking up in you. Control doesn't heal. It just keeps the wounds from bleeding out in public. You've mistaken emotional control for healing because it's quieter, more manageable. It doesn't leave stains. It doesn't interrupt your schedule. It doesn't force you to scream or collapse or question everything you thought you knew about yourself. But that's not healing. That's anesthesia. Real healing is messy, disorienting. It arrives with no invitation. It asks questions you've buried for years. It breaks things that never should have held you together in the first place. And most of all, it doesn't make sense. You've built a structure where everything is explainable, predictable, where your emotions must behave themselves or be exiled. But what if the emotions you've silenced are the only ones still trying to lead you home? Carl Jung spoke of the self as something that only emerges when the ego relinquishes its grip, and you've gripped so tightly for years, maybe your whole life, because the unknown felt like danger, because freedom once meant pain, because letting go once meant being left behind. So you created a version of safety where everything is muted, where the chaos is managed, where nothing unexpected ever knocks too loud. But in that silence, something sacred went missing. You confuse stillness with peace, but you've only muted the parts of you that still believe in freedom. And now they're starting to wake up, not with words, but with restlessness, with dreams that shake you, with fatigue that feels older than your body, with that ache behind your eyes that comes from not having cried in months. You can't heal in the same place where you stopped feeling, and control, no matter how refined, will never give you back what you buried to feel safe. You've been carrying a secret, the secret that beneath all the noise, all the racing thoughts, all the planning, there is a quiet waiting, awaiting not for answers, but for a guarantee, for a promise that this time, this life, this story won't shatter you like the last. But life doesn't give guarantees. It doesn't offer contracts or safety nets. It asks for presence, for courage, for honesty. It demands a kind of surrender you never signed up for, the surrender of certainty. Carl Jung called this the process of individuation, the painful, beautiful, terrifying journey of stepping into the unknown, not with maps, but with truth, not with answers, but with openness. You're not broken. You're terrified of what a life without scripts might demand of you, of what it means to be fully seen, not as a collection of your plans or your roles, but as a soul, raw and unfinished. Viktor Frankl said, "What man actually needs is not a tensionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal. You've been craving peace, but maybe what you truly need is purpose, a reason to bear the tension. To walk through the wilderness of your own truth. You were never meant to live inside certainty. You were meant to survive the wilderness, to face the abyss, look into it, and still choose to move forward. This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a way of being that refuses safety as a condition for life. You're not alone. And yes, there is still time to walk through the unknown and not disappear."